So we start now, topic on security. So welcome everyone in this security part of the course. Quick reminder where we are. So for the rest of today, we'll discuss security in the smart grid. You have quizzes that are ongoing, depending on which group you're in. Don't forget to do them. The quizzes are meant to be done one per week, so it might be difficult to catch up, so don't be late. And then one lab is due on Thursday, and after that we'll have another lab that will last for 2 weeks, and with a bit more time due to the Easter break. Today we will start a course on security. I'm giving here a reference. There are many references on security. Why do we talk about security in this course? Of course, this is not a course about security of the smart grid, but since we're talking of communication, perhaps the most pressing problem today in communication networks is security. And smart grid is at the heart of security problems or attacks. You probably have heard of attacks against power systems in Ukraine in the context of international disputes. More recently in India, well, if you look at the news, probably every month there is a problem on a power grid somewhere in the world, which often, not always of course, but often is attributed to cyber attacks. Perhaps a very famous attack that that's present in the literature is the Aurora generator attack, that shows that by attacking the computer network, it was possible to break a physical asset here by taking control of the software that sends messages to actuators, and by sending the wrong messages, then you can have things that spin too fast or that have pressure that is too high, that leads to physical damage. And if you do that in a consolidated way, you can provoke a blackout or serious damage to an electrical grid here. So when we say cybersecurity means the security of the IT, of the computer information technology infrastructure. But the major thing to remember is that by attacking the IT infrastructure, we can take control of machines and therefore create damage. But also we can induce fake measurements. This is something that those of you who take the advanced part will be able to exercise in the lab. By taking fake measurements, then you can change the eyes of the system, and by changing the eyes, you can lead the system to do wrong actions, very much against what the operators are thinking that it do. You can lead to, as I said, generate diesel generators that are destroyed. You may also, by faking PMU measurements, you can lead the operators to think that the power flows are very different from what they are. So they may take wrong decisions that might lead to congestion, tripping lines, or even burning of some assets here. So what we will discuss today and next week is what are the classical cybersecurity mechanisms that must be implemented in every system that we use, and in particular in the smart grid. Before diving into this, I must also give a warning here, is that this is not sufficient. It is not because you deploy cryptography and authentication that your grid will be secure. So a large fraction of security is also at the human level. Of course, if your grid is not secure, if your PMU measurements are not authenticated, then anybody can mount a man-in-the-middle attack and forge them. So that's the basic stuff. So you must, of course, authenticate everything and encrypt every important message here. But that's not sufficient, because encryption and authentication require things like passwords. And those passwords, if they are written on a piece of paper that's left around to anybody who can enter the substation, for example, then your grid will not be secured here. So password protection is, of course, a very important topic. You should never use the same password twice. So, in fact, many attacks against the smart grid or against electrical grids, even if they're not that smart, are based on gaining passwords. So if some users use the same password in their email account as in their job account, then getting the email account password by sending a fake email to somebody that will lead them to go to the wrong site and typing their credentials is a very simple attack, and one of the most efficient attacks today. So password protection, of course, is very important. Use two-factor authentication that require, for example, not just a password, but another mechanism that requires you to have a device, like we use a Epfl for inputting grades, for example, or use also a password manager to avoid using the same password in two different sites. Voilà, that was my basic preaching about good security practices. Now let's dive into what in IT is meant by cybersecurity. Cybersecurity leads from the fact that the internet, by default, as well as other communication mechanisms that are specific to the smart grid, is not secure. So the basic systems, the basic principles of packet switching are not at all supporting security. So security came as an afterthought that needs to be added. In particular, if A sends a message to B, so A can be a PMU or any kind of sensor, and B can be a control center or a data collection mechanism, anybody can intercept the communication and read the data. So not being able to read the data is called confidentiality. Why is it important to have confidentiality? Well, if an attacker wants to mount a useful attack, the attacker needs to gain information about your system. How is your system operating? What are the typical parameters? What are the ranges of operation? So if you can read all the information in the clear on the wires, then you can get that. Can you read on the wires? Yes, that's very easy. If you have access to the Ethernet lines, for example, when I'm using here Ethernet for this Zoom session, there's a cable going from my computer through the wall to an ADSL modem, and the ADSL modem has another cable that goes through the basement to a telecom box somewhere. Anybody who's able to gain access to this cable, for example, by pretending to be a construction worker coming into my house to repair something and then connect to the cable and put a little, what is called a man-in-the-middle box, then they will be able to get all the information without me knowing that they do get that information. So that's, to prevent that is being confidential. Now, an attacker can do other things. An attacker can modify the message. If you put a box in the middle, then a stronger attack that you can do consists in taking the messages, modifying them, and sending them again. For example, if you can pretend to be a PDC to a PMU, so you can open the communication line, pretend to be a PDC, receive all the PDC messages, and send the forged messages to the intended PDC. Then the PDC believes they come from the PMU, but they come from an attacker that has modified them. This is how you mount an attack to create congestions in a grid, for example. Another dimension is called non-repudiation. That's another topic, but that we will also cover. If some of the devices are third parties, so they come, for example, at an interconnection point where multiple grids have to work together, A can send a message to B, and then A was a bit sloppy and the message was not correct, then they didn't follow all the procedures to do things right, so B will take wrong decisions that might cause, for example, to a cascading outage that will cost billions of Swiss francs of damage. Then B will come back to A and say, hey, I did that because you didn't do your job. Then A can say, oh, but that's not true at all. This is not the message I had sent to you. So being immune against such attacks is called being immune against repudiation. A can repudiate the message that it sends to B, and we that also would like to have mechanisms to prevent that from happening. So we'll see how classical cybersecurity mechanisms are able to avoid that.
Sorry, I didn't understand well repudiation.
Thank you for your question. Repudiation means I sent a message, I send a message to B, and this message is corrupt for whatever reason, perhaps because my device is wrong or because something went wrong in my operation. And then B does actions based on that happen to be very bad because the information was wrong. Then when B complains to you and say, hey, I did something wrong because of you, now you must pay to me 2 million Swiss francs to recover from the damage from which I am liable. then A can pretend that this message was never sent, can do a replay, forge its logs and say, oh, here is the message I sent to you. And now you have two parties that are A that said, I have sent this message to you, and B that said, no, I have received this one. So who is right? This is in a smart grid context. In everyday's life, you can go to a website and say, I ordered a blue table and you sent me a pink table, and I never ordered a blue table. So then how can we be sure that who is right? You can always forge an email that you send to somebody saying, hey, here is the email of confirmation email I received from you. It says, here is an order for this or this, including a pink table, but I forge it, I write blue instead of pink in the email that you sent to me. If I do this, I am repudiating the order I sent to you, but because I realize after the fact that I did something wrong, so I changed my mind now. That's in a case where A is sloppy. It could be also an intentional attack. A may want B to do something wrong by sending an intentionally wrong message and later pretend that A did not send it. Does it solve your question? I assume yes. So let's move on. Here are examples of the attacker can be the intended, you're talking to somebody who is perhaps not in the same company and might be a company that does not have the same type of reliability that you would like to have, but it can also be an attacker that's on the line, and the attacker, in the case of somebody who's simply listening, can be passive, but in the case of forging a message can be active. So those are all the dimensions that we want to be immune against. For that, we will see that there's a number of building blocks that are called symmetric cryptography, asymmetric cryptography, MAC, etc. That we will go through now one after the other. So let's start with the most used one. That's things we're probably using now as we're going via Zoom. All our data is encrypting using symmetric cryptography. So what is symmetric cryptography? It works as follows. Here I have some message to send in the language of cryptography. This is called a plain text. Plain text means the message as it is, non-encrypted here. Then if I want to send it over the line using symmetric cryptography, I must have a secret key. So the key is some string of bits that must be secret between me and the intended recipient. So symmetric, that's why it's called symmetric. The key is the same for both ends, and both must know the secret key. So if I want to send something very secret to you, we must find a way to have the secret key before. Perhaps I send you a message over WhatsApp or whatever with the key, and once you have the key, I can send and you can decrypt. So the encryption software or hardware will take the key and the original message and transforming into an encrypted message, which is called the ciphertext here. And now the property, if everything works well, the property is that the ciphertext can be completely public, because in order to read it, we must decrypt, and for that we must know the key that is assumed to be secret here. So we assume, any good cryptography system must have the property that recovering the plain text, the original message, without knowing the key must be quasi-impossible. In cryptography, things are never really impossible. If you have enough computing power, you might break things, but we hope that the computing power that is required to break the key is so large that even the strongest attacker in the world in millions of years would not be able to do it. That is the confidentiality property here. So we need the key to decrypt, and the key must be kept secret. How does it work? Well, here is perhaps one of the oldest historical symmetric cryptography system that was used for real at the times of Julius Caesar, at the times of Asterix. Julius Caesar was sending messages that were important by encrypting them using this symmetric encryption scheme. So the key was a shift in the alphabet. So in this simple case where every letter is written in capital only, that means there are 26 letters, and the shift is a number between 1 and 26. And the encryption simply consists in shifting by k positions. For example, if k is equal to 3 in alphabetic order, A becomes D, B becomes E, Z becomes C, etc. And in order to decrypt, you need to have the key, and Julius Theda believed that this was good enough. For example, let's see if it's really good enough. Here is, assume you are at the times of asterisk, you see this message here, given in the title, using a Caesar cipher, and you're asked to decrypt it. You're one of the employees of the Roman army, and you have to decrypt it, or you're an attacker, you're one of the Gauls trying to know what the Romans are saying, and are you able to decrypt it without having the key here? I close the poll in a few seconds. Closing. And the majority says C, which is the correct answer. How can we see that? Well, we can do if we have a computer today, we can do a brute force attack by trying all the shifts from 1 to 26. This is what I did here. And if I do that, I will look for sentences that make sense. I find one here. So that must, and that's the only one. So that must be the answer. So this is how I cracked Julius Caesar's cipher. It was very easy here because I could try by brute force all the keys. Of course, this is not a very smart cipher. I guess it was secure or believed to be secure at the time of the Roman Empire because very few people could read. So this was secrecy by obscurity. Very people, even if the message was not encrypted, very few people could know what it means. And those who could read did not have even paper to write. So writing what I'm doing here, writing on the brute force things, was already something costly because you were writing with systems that were perhaps not so easy. Not so costly for such a short message, but if the message was a bit longer and was using several keys, perhaps that was good enough. Of course, this is not a good encryption system. Not just because I could do a brute force attack, but also you can see, for example, that a letter is always encrypted to the same letter. So it would be also by analyzing the ciphertext, we know that, for example, we could guess things about the letter. So by a bit of work, we could do more. But the main thing to remember here is we could do a brute force attack by trying all keys, right? And that is always possible. Of course, today's encryption systems are not Caesar's cipher. The most widespread symmetric encryption system is AES, that we will discuss now. The key thing is that the size of the key must be large because it is always possible to do a brute force attack. So if my key would be 10 bits length, 2 to the power 10 gives 1,000 possible keys, then I could encrypt it 1,000 times and look at all the 1,000 messages that I receive. Is there one of the messages that could make sense? So in order for such a system to work, we must be sure that the key is large enough. So typically, keys that are used today are 256 bits, which gives 2 to the power 200, which is in decimal 25 divided 81 divided by followed by 80 zeros. So it's a truly astronomical numbers. Even if you have millions of computers, it will take you more than millions of years to try by brute force all the keys. So first thing we know, we need key size that are very large here. How does AES work? Well, first it's a block cipher. Block means it applies to strings of bits that are of constant length. So AES always takes a block of 128 bits. Messages are typically larger than 128 bits. Therefore, if your message is larger, for example, our Zoom session here is our Zoom encoder will take blocks of data and take the packets as they are generated by the video encoder and will break them into smaller blocks of 128 bits. AES does what we can call a permutation of the string of 128 bits. What does a permutation mean here? It means that I'm showing here on the on the left here, all the possible input values for a string of 128 bits. Of course, I cannot show them all because there is 2 to the power of 128, which is a truly astronomical number. The first one is 00, the last one is 111. So you take all those possible values. Nobody can draw it, but as a thought experiment, we can imagine that we do. Then each of those is mapped to another one here. And it's a one-to-one mapping. 00 is mapped to another one here, and vice versa. The map 00 corresponds to one of the other strings here. That's what we call a permutation. That's a one-to-one mapping. For one value of a 128-bit string, there is one encrypted value and only one, and vice versa. For any encrypted value, there is only one indeed. So it's a one-to-one mapping, a bijection. Of course, the trick is that different keys give different permutations. And the hope is that the permutation that you obtain by using a given key is very hard to predict or impossible to predict here. How does it work internally? We'll not go through that. It's very complicated. It chains a number of operations where at every step of the operations, we do what is called a byte substitution. So we take the block, which is a block of 128 bits, which corresponds to 16 bytes. Every block of 16 bytes is first transformed using a table that is modified by the key here. So we first shuffle the values of the bytes, then we write the message into a big matrix, then we shift the row, mix the columns, and that gives us a new message. And then using another part of the key, we do it again and again, and we do the XOR of all this here. And at the end, we obtain an output. So analyzing AES is very difficult. It's not based on a mathematical transformation like other schemes that we will discuss, but it is believed that those operations are so complicated that it's impossible to revert them. So if I give you the output and you don't know the key, it's impossible to know the thing back. So it is believed, but paradoxically not mathematically proven, that AES is secure in the sense that it does not provide any information about the plain text, even if you observe many encrypted texts for whom you know the plain text. So this is known as a non-plain text attack. So if you are an attacker, you observe a number of messages for where you know what is the plain text, the original message, and the encrypted one, with some bad encryption messages. For example, with Caesar's cipher, if I give you the plain text and the encrypted one, you will immediately know the shift by looking at how much shift there is between the first letter of the plain text and the first letter of the cipher text. You will know the key by doing what is called a known plain text attack. Of course, with modern cryptographic schemes, this must not occur. So we say that AES must be immune to known plain text attacks. This has been, of course, screened by a number of researchers that have broken this to sub-problems that can be proven, but it's not, the only thing we can say today is the best researchers in crypto-analysis have not found a way to do known plain text attacks. But it doesn't mean it will not happen one day. So security is only valid at a given point in time. However, yes?
A small question.
Sure.
Is all protocols should be reversible? Like, is it a condition for them?
What do you mean by reversible?
Like, if you have the encrypted message, you could always find a way to come back and find a way, but I mean by that it is possible to find a way come back mathematically, not like in a calculatory way. Like it is always possible to find it if you know the keys.
Of course, if you know the key, you must be able to decrypt. Otherwise, your system is not usable.
Okay.
So yes, the answer is yes. Whenever I have a plain text, M, I transform it with using a key. I obtain a ciphertext. I must be able to decrypt if I know the key. That's the principle of symmetric cryptography. So the answer is yes. For
thank you.
cryptography to work, it must be a one-to-one mapping once you know the key.
Okay.
And you must be able to do it. So, of course, I showed the encryption part. Perhaps that's reason due to that. I showed the encryption part of AES. Of course, if you know the key, you can reverse all the operations, but you must know all the orange values here. If you don't know the orange values, you will do random operations that will produce garbage. And you have to try all possible values of the key to have something that works. And since you do it in a way that is chained one after the other, researchers believe today that it's not possible to crack it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. However, it's not sufficient because chosen plain text attacks are always possible, even against the best possible block cipher like AES is. What is a chosen plain text attack? Well, assume the adversary has been able to observe the encryption of a number of messages, M1, M2, Mn. You ask the system to encrypt them, or you trigger them to encrypt them, and you see the encrypted result. That may be, for example, because the system is used by a public service that anybody can use, so you can connect and see what the result of the encryption is. So you will have a catalog of plain text and the corresponding ciphertext here. This is also easy to do because many protocols have, for example, error messages. If you go to the website and the website doesn't have the file, it will answer with error 404 with a given text. And depending on which software the website is using, you can predict exactly which message will come. So if the website is encrypted, whatever comes out of it, you can cause errors by asking explicitly for pages that don't exist, for example. So this is a classical use of such an attack. And then you create a catalog of messages and the corresponding ciphertext. Of course, because this is a secure system, that does not give you much information about the key. You still don't know the key, you cannot decrypt. However, what you can do is you can infer, once you have a catalog that's large enough, whenever you see a ciphertext like M3, you know that when you see a ciphertext like C3, you know that the plaintext was M3. So if you have a large catalog of pairs, plaintext, block, encrypted block, whenever you see one encrypted block during another interaction, perhaps weeks later, if you see an encrypted block somewhere that comes and is in your catalog, you know what the plaintext was. For example, you might be observing somebody whom you're attacking, and you know now that this file does not exist, for example, because you have already observed the encrypted response that came when the file does not exist here. So this is what is called a chosen plaintext attack. If the attacker can choose the plaintext and trigger the system to generate a large number of encrypted text, then by choosing the plaintext that are most frequently used, then you can defeat the purpose of cryptography. So of course you must you must be immune against that. And the classical method is to use a nonce. A nonce is a number that we add into the system to make every plaintext different. So it's a text that is different at every use of the encryption with the same key. So whenever now I encrypt a message, I must know my secret key, but I also must know a nonce, which doesn't need to be secret because it's sufficient to generate different text. So what we do is, in fact, we merge the plaintext with the nonce. That makes it a different plaintext that is encrypted. And then when we decrypt, we must know the nonce. So because we must know the nonce at decryption, typically the nonce is not secret, it's to be known. But the attacker now, if the attacker sees a sequence of ciphertext, every ciphertext will be different. So even if the same message is sent several times, if you record a combination of plain text and ciphertext, because the nonce will be different, when the same plain text is repeated again, the ciphertext will be different. So the key thing is that the nonce must be different at every invocation of the plain text. So AES is not used as I mentioned a minute ago, but it is always used in combination with a nonce. For some reason, there are two possible ways to implement a nonce with AES. They're called CBC or CTR. CBC stands for chaining, and the type of nonce you use is called the mode of operation of AES. In CBC, you start with a random number, that is your initial nonce, that you XOR with your message. XOR means for every, you first translate your message into bits, like every computer does, and then you bit by bit XOR every bit of the message with the initialization vector, with your random initial number. And this initialization vector is public, is sent in the clear to the destination here. That generates a first cipher block here, encrypted block. And then for the following next block, the next 128 bits, you will use as nonce the encrypted first block here that you will XOR, etc. So this is called chaining. So of course, if anything goes wrong, if you lose, for example, C2, then you cannot decrypt C3. So this is a very strong system because each of the nonces themselves appear to be completely random because they come from the encryption. A variant of that, which is a bit simpler on the receiver side, consists in starting a counter, and then for every block that you send, you increment the counter that you use as a nonce here, instead of using it from the result of the encryption. This is a bit simpler, in particular if you lose. If I send you 10,000 messages and you know that one of the messages is lost, you can still decrypt the other ones because you can infer what the value of the counter should be for the messages that are received here. So those are the two practical ways in which AES is used. So,
sorry?
Yes?
Excuse me. The key, who knows? Only the provider, or?
The key must be secret between the sender and the receiver. Right?
So the provider of the service, for example, Zoom or any provider, they know the key or they don't know the key?
We will discuss that. Of course, in simple mechanisms, we could assume yes, that, well, the software at Zoom and the software in my computer both must know the secret key, right? How this is done, we will discover a bit later. Of course, one of the problems of symmetric encryption is how we set up those keys, right? Zoom never asked me for a random number or a password or something, so this key was created automatically. We will see that using another mechanism called asymmetric encryption, we can generate keys, and the problem of key generation is a central problem in cryptography that we will discuss next week.
So Zoom can decrypt our messages technically if they know the key.
Not only they can, but they do. Here, my camera, my computer is sending an encrypted stream to the Zoom server, and the Zoom server must decrypt it to merge it with your audio, for example, when you talk. So Zoom, the encryption is only to protect us against people who would be listening to our conversation over the wires. But if Zoom themselves are malicious, of course, we're not protecting against that because they know because of this merging of the operation. When we use WhatsApp, for example, where WhatsApp encrypts end-to-end, if I send a WhatsApp message to you, then only our two devices can decrypt it. Then we are truly protected. But as soon as you do things into group, where you merge information, typically, at least with video, when you have to transform the messages, then you decrypt because of the transformation, at least with today's technology in Zoom. But of course, techniques exist to prevent that from happening.
Okay, thank you.
So, as a quick recap, we have seen a mechanism called AES that provides symmetric encryption with key sizes that must be large enough, and that provides confidentiality in the sense that whoever reads the message sees only a random sequence of bits and kind of has no idea of what the bits mean, even if we see repeated occurrence of the same encrypted text. Something important to keep in mind is that there are many other symmetric encryption mechanisms. And why are there many? Well, because we're never 100% sure that something really works. For example, there is a historical precedent. Before AES, the standard, AES is a standard today. Before that, the standard was DES. That was believed also similar to AES, is shifting things in a way that appears to be so complicated that nobody will break it. However, somebody broke it. Professor in Zurich, in fact, in the 80s, broke it and showed that there is a possible attack against DES, which caused, of course, everybody to have to change the software. So the take-home message is an encryption scheme is secure as long as an attack has not been found and made public against it, right? Which means that whenever we have encryption software or hardware, we must have the ability to change the encryption method. If it's in hardware, it's more of a problem. If you're using all the hardware that was using DES need to be thrown away, probably, except if it's programmable hardware. But this is also typically why in software we will try always to have the ability to negotiate the encryption mechanism here, which has to be taken very seriously. One standard attack against any mechanism consists in asking the end device to use an encryption mechanism that is obsolete. For example, if you want to attack a site and you say, please use DES, then that's suspicious. It's probably because this site will, because everybody knows now how to break DES, will be able to read all the confidential information that you send. So take-home message, encryption software must be updated regularly to make sure that it uses the current software, the current encryption method that is known to be secure. Voilà, little quiz to test your understanding. Which of the two sentences that I'm writing here do you believe are correct? So you can write on the screen if you like to write, or you can also use the poll feature. You should have a pop-up window that shows on your screen where you can enter the answer that you think is correct. I close the poll in a few minutes, a few seconds. Closing now. And the majority says A, which is the correct answer. A block cipher encrypts blocks, of course, and it's invertible for who knows the key. Next question. About nonces. What do you think is true of the three possible statements I'm making here? Closing the poll in a few seconds.
Excuse me, what was the answer for the last one? I didn't see.
What are?
Was the answer for the last poll? It was both of them?
Both of them, yes.
Both
Yes.
of them, yes. Thank you.
So I'm closing this one. And the majority says A and B, which is the correct answer. Oops. So a nonce should never be used more than once in combination with the same key. That's exactly the purpose of the nonce, right? We avoid these attacks based on replaying known messages. A nonce need not be secret, which is also true. And in fact, for practical reasons, the nonce is not secret, because if it's secret, that means for every message we have a different key, a different nonce that becomes a key. So that's not the purpose. A nonce must be random. Some systems use random nonces, some other not. So it is believed that even having perfectly predictable nonces is sufficient if your basic block cipher, like AES, shuffles things well enough. If you change one bit in a message somewhere, even if this bit is perfectly predictable, the encryption system makes the output unpredictable. Voilà, so that was our first building block, which is the encryption software, or the encryption, symmetric encryption. Second building block is authentication. Message authentication code, small name, little name MAC. MAC stands for message authentication code and stands for both the message, the method, and the string of bits that we add to a message to authenticate it. How does it work? So I have a message to send, and I want to make sure that no attacker can modify it. Then what I do, I compute a tag, T, which is a small suffix I add to the message, that is computed using a secret key that the recipient must also have. And then when you receive the message, you receive M and the tag, then you recompute the tag using the secret key. And if you find exactly the value T that was sent in the message, then with high probability, it means that the message is authentic here. We say with high probability because the security property of a good MAC system is that if you don't know the key, even after observing many pairs of message and tag, it's not possible to create a valid tag for a new message that you have not yet seen. So it's not possible to forge a tag, which is what the attacker would do. The attacker would like to transform the value M of the message. But if you do that, you need to know what is the value of the tag that should be. And presumably, it is impossible to know if you don't know the secret key. So that provides authenticity. That shows that the message that you received is the one that was written by somebody who knew the key. Presumably, there's only another guy, the receiver, but there's only one other than the receiver who knew it. So that shows that it's authentic in that sense. And also that the message was not modified. That's the integrity property. That means nobody has changed it, because if it had been changed, I would have seen it. Here is a simple MAC invented by Homer that is based on this what is called a linear error detection code. So Homer, who works in another, not in security, but in another system, knows error detection. Error detection is what we use, for example, when we write data to a disk, and there are a few bits here and there. So we want to be able to discover those errors and correct them. So we use systems like this one here. It consists in computing the tag by modulo arithmetic. So if P is an integer that is a prime number, the modulo P prime arithmetic is very good things that is used in many places in error correction, also in cryptography. Because all the nice properties of algebra that we know, solving equations, all that stuff works exactly the same way, but in modulo arithmetic. Modulo means, for example, if I compute modulo 257, it means I'm interested only in the remainder of any number when we divide by 257. So the modulo is between 0 and 256. If I have a message M, I multiply it by A, 58, for example. I add B, which gives me a number. the message M is first translated into a number by, for example, if I write the message in using some kind of encoding, I will have a string of bits, and the string of bits can be imagined to be the binary representation of a number. So this number M is what I use here. For example, if I have the string hello, and if I use the simple ASCII mapping, in practice we would use UTF, probably it would be longer, but for the illustration purpose that's enough. H is translated to 48, those are two hexadecimal digits, 48. E is translated to 45, L to 4C, 4C, 4F, etc. This is not encryption, this is just encoding. Now I interpret that as a number, that's the sequence of digits of a number, that's fairly large. I multiply it by 58, I add 180, and I take the modulo P. Modulo P will return me a number between 0 and 256, which in this case happens to be 35 in hexadecimal. So the tag that corresponds to that is 35. So we can use that, for example, if I send you a message about, for example, Intelex sending, here is a message to transfer some money to my bank. I compute the tag. Now, if the attacker tampers with the message, one way of tampering is to changing the destination bank account, which of course would be a very powerful attack, an attack that is done, by the way. But then you need to recompute the tag because I've modified here the message. The new value of the tag should be 74, but the bad guy who doesn't know A and B perhaps cannot compute the new 74. Or what do you think? Do you think that it's true that the bad guy cannot compute the values A and B? I close the poll in a few seconds. And the majority says B, which is the correct answer. In fact, the properties of modular arithmetics when the modulus is prime are such that we can solve equations very easily. So if I see two messages, M1, M2, and the corresponding tags, then by solving a system of two equations with two unknowns, I can compute A and B. Here is the solution, for example. Finding the solution requires computing the inverse of M1 minus M2 modulo P, and the inverse can be easily computed by linear time, by polynomial time algorithms called Bezout's algorithm. So even if the numbers are very large, it's absolutely possible to do that, which means that's a bad Mac. Homer's Mac does not work. It works only once, but not twice here. So of course we don't use things like this. We must use a Mac that has the property that even after seeing a large numbers of combinations M1, T1, we cannot guess the key here. One classical Mac is based on AES, works as follows. If I have a message here, I take the length of the message. This bar means the length of the message. So I translate the message into a sequence of bits. It doesn't have to be one block. So it is typically a large number of blocks here. I take the length of the message as a bootstrap value. I encrypt it with a secret key with AES. I obtain a first block that is encrypted. Then I XOR this first block with the first part of my message. I encrypt it with AES, I obtain a second, etc. I continue. And at the end, what I obtain is one block of 128 bits, which is my tag here. And it is shown that the strength of this way of making a tag is the same is derives from the fact that we cannot attack AES. So if it is not possible to guess the key from seeing a number of message encryptions, or if it's not possible to decrypt a message from seeing a number of ciphertexts, then it is not possible to forge correct tags when we have our own values of the message and we don't know the key here. So the fact that AES is secure means that this way of doing a MAC is secure. Be careful, it's called CBC MAC, has nothing to do with CBC chaining mode, operational mode of AES. It's a different thing. Here we're talking of a MAC, the same primitive AES is used, but this is not encryption here. Here the message and the tag are sent in the clear. Right? It's just a verification. Next week, we will discuss how we combine authentication and confidentiality and encryption here. But for today, we'll stay here. So take care, do the quiz, finish the labs, and don't hesitate to ask questions on the Moodle forum.
A small question. I didn't understand what is the difference between MAC and the encryption. Like they both like encrypt the message.
No,
I'm not sure.
No. So if you have a message here, so the question is, what's the difference between MAC and encryption? Here I have a message. Perhaps this message is one page of text, so thousands of blocks of 128 bits. At the end of this operation, I just have one block of 128 bits. So okay. It's a verification tag. Having the verification tag alone will not allow me to recover the text, the original text, because there are more combinations of text than a tag. So it is possible, in theory, that different messages lead to the same tag, simply by counting. There are more messages than tags, so there must be different messages that lead to the same tag. Whereas for encryption, once I know the key, there's a one-to-one mapping from plain text to ciphertext. Here it's not true.
So MAC, is it just to verify that the message was not modified and was sent by the right user?
Exactly. It is to verify that this message, the T, if somebody who knows the key can verify that the T comes from M1, M2, M3. With some probability, because of course, there can be different messages that lead to the same, but if the system is well done, the probability that that happens is the same as the probability computed by doing a random tag. So if I change one bit somewhere in M2, the probability that or if I take another message, the probability that the tag is the same is a probability that two strings of 128 bits are equal when the bits are chosen independently and with equal probability. So it is 2 to the power minus 128, which is an astronomically small number. Does it answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Good. So thank you, everyone. Again, if you have other questions, don't hesitate to ask now or a bit later.